You're listening to episode 28 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Judson Brewer joins us to speak about his role as the Director of Research at the Center for Mindfulness. There is a lot of hype around mindfulness these days. We find a mix of responsible and accurate journalism and inaccurate sensationalism overlaying a foundation of potentially great research. So what does it take to do good research? And what are some of the key organizations in mindfulness doing to step up their game to ensure quality results? Judd Brewer is a psychiatrist and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for addictions, having developed and tested novel mindfulness programs for addictions, including both in-person and application-based treatments. He has also studied the underlying neural mechanisms of mindfulness using standard and real-time fMRI and is currently translating these findings into clinical use. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, spoken at international conferences, presented to the U.S. President's Office of National Drug Control Policy, been featured at TEDx, Time Magazine Top 100 New Health Discoveries of 2013, Forbes, Business Week, NPR, and the BBC, among others. Our guest today is Dr. Judson Brewer. Judd, welcome to Present Moment.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into our main topic today, would you tell us a little bit about your own background with contemplative practices? How did you start?
Well, there's this loose 10,000-hour rule that somebody came up with and Malcolm Gladwell kind of popularized in one of his books. And I can say probably way before I started medical school in 1996, I hit that 10,000-hour benchmark in terms of suffering. And so I would certainly say that I'm an expert in suffering. I have logged many more than 10,000 hours. And while I was racking up my hours, my senior year of college, I was about to graduate from Princeton. My girlfriend and I got engaged to get married. We were both going to start MD, PhD programs at Washington University in St. Louis. And we broke up right after signing leases for apartments a couple of doors down from each other. It was in 1996 before we started medical school. And though I was pretty type A, I, for the first time, was having real trouble sleeping and didn't know what to do. Was really stressed out. And somehow this book, this Full Catastrophe Living book that Jon Kabat-Zinn wrote, landed in my lap. He and I joke about this because I read about a third of it and started listening to the cassette tapes pretty religiously every morning. I think my first day of medical school was my first day, formally starting meditation. And I would fall asleep for about 6 months listening to these things, couldn't stay awake, and eventually was able to stay awake and found that it was really helpful for me. And I really got into it and would even find myself just paying attention to my breath during boring medical school lectures during the first and second year of medical school. Something productive could come out of this. And it was really helpful. And I'd gone into this medical scientist training program being very interested in this interface between stress and the immune system. Why do we get sick when we're stressed out? And was kind of doing this own experiment myself. How was I not able to sleep? How was I getting messed up just from my own thinking patterns? And really got into the practice. When I get interested in something, I tend to just go for it. And I went for it and joined a Sangha in St. Louis, started going on weekend retreats, went on my first week-long retreat with Bhante Gunaratana a couple of years later.
Bhavana Society?
Somebody had arranged for him to give a week-long in St. Louis. And so it's a local one, which was fabulous. And I actually found my first teacher, Ginny Morgan, when she was the manager of that retreat, and I had found myself crying on her shoulder when I couldn't concentrate. it's a very type A, like, I'm going to go for it, medical student crying. And I worked with Ginny for about 10 years. She was a wonderful, kind teacher. And, I just got more and more and more into it. And by the time I finished my PhD and went back in to finish my medical school, I gave up doing animal research. I was a molecular biologist doing conditional knockout mouse experiments, looking at glucocorticoid receptors and things like that, and really said, ethically, I don't feel comfortable killing mice anymore. Then went back into medical school, really got into psychiatry, the last thing I thought I was going to do, because I could really see this link between the psychiatric components of mental disorders and what the Buddha was talking about, and started residency, wondering what I was going to do research wise. And at that point, I was at Yale, and there was this neuroscience training program where we could actually do some research during residency. And I started doing clinical work, studying mindfulness for addictions. That was in 2005 or so. And there was very, very little published at that time, and there was virtually nothing published in addictions. And so, people were telling me I was going to throw away my career. I published pretty well, with the molecular biology work, and, this mindfulness was like it was a career killer. So everybody thought, and I just made this resolve. I said to myself, even if I don't make it as a researcher, at least I will have gone forth doing what I want to do. And felt very, very strongly about that, and felt that I wouldn't have any regrets if I didn't make it, and I would figure out something else to do.
It's interesting. Every guest of the podcast who does research for a living has said that same thing, that they're always recommended, don't get into mindfulness. That's just kind of the end of your career. And yet, these are very successful people. And is it your sense that this may also be turning around, that mindfulness is shifting towards this is a really good area to get into?
Right now, it is a very good area to get into in terms of it's a very hot area. And there are a lot of hot areas that pop up, every couple of years. And so right now, it is a good area to get into. I don't know how long that will last, because a lot of people are going into it because it's a hot area. I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of genuine interest, but that wave will certainly crest and fall, and we'll see what's left after that. And I think, there will be another hot area of research. I just don't know what it is. So it certainly is a good area right now. It'll be really interesting to see how much of a foundation is left after the tide turns.
Yeah, this is the exact term I was thinking of, is what's going to be left as a solid foundation after the smoke clears from this fire of excitement.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, it's human nature. People get excited about new things, and, it's interesting because this is a new thing, yet it's an old thing. If you think about this in evolutionary terms, so I like to think of this as half-life, like, what's the half-life of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is probably the most validated and studied behavioral therapy right now? Well, it's only been around about 40 years, and it's not the hot thing right now. Mindfulness is the hot thing. So it hasn't, it kind of peaked after about 40 years. If you look at psychoanalysis, it was very, very hot in the 50s. Psychiatry residents were even trained to use it with very psychotic patients because that's all there was. And so that was really hot. And, that, I don't know, we'll give it 100 years. So let's say you were kind to these things and give them each 100 years. If you look back at the Buddhist psychological models, they've been around 2,500 years. That's an order and a half of magnitude longer. That's a long time. So even from an evolutionary standpoint, the core tenets have been around unchanged, uncompeted, unoutcompeted, if that's a phrase. They have not been outcompeted for 2,500 years. Nothing has shown better effects. And believe me, if there were something better, I would be studying it. Why would I study, this stuff if there was something better? I wouldn't.
Judd, you mentioned in your own practice over the course of a decade where you were actively working on things, as you started doing longer retreats, that there was some struggle being a particular personality type that has, I'd say, a fairly heightened sense of self-criticism. There's some wrestling a bit with the non-judging and the non-striving aspects of a mindfulness practice. What helped you most? Was there any one thing, or was it just over the course of time, an ongoing practice that helped with that?
I wish there were one thing. Maybe sheer exhaustion. I remember being on retreats at IMS in the middle of winter, sweating through t-shirts in the middle of the meditation hall, which isn't particularly warm. And I remember being on a retreat with a wonderful Vietnamese monk, and I think something got lost in translation because I was saying, yeah, I'm exhausted, I'm working really hard, and I was taking naps between every chance that I could. And he's like, yes, yeah, good, burning off the fetters. And I realized later I was just driving my ass off. And I was at a self-retreat later, a couple of years later, and the teacher just laughed at me and she said, everybody has their path, and your path to liberation is going to be through striving. There's skillful practice like your head's on fire, and then there's striving. So it took, I don't know when it started to dawn on me. It was probably just a couple of years ago, where I was actually working with some experienced meditators who were coming through my lab, and it's really a privilege to be able to do that because you get to learn all these different things that people are doing. And I would actually have people stay at my house for up to 2 weeks at a time because I really wanted to see if these guys were walking the walk. And so I'd learn a lot of different things that people were playing with. And there was one particular practice that really caught my attention that was most related to, I think, is Mark Coleman, who teaches these wilderness practices where you go out, you look at the bark of a tree, and you just become fascinated and let your interest rip, let the curiosity rip. And, that type of practice really, well, that was one of the pieces that really helped me see the non-striving aspect, this effortless quality of awareness. And there was also, this is what it was. It was doing, for 2 years, I actually tried really, really hard to do jhana practice and was, working really, really hard to do this, the POC style. And I finally gave up just out of sheer exhaustion and started just doing loving kindness, figuring if I don't get jhana, at least I'll have done a lot of loving kindness practice because I'm sitting for hours at a time and just really, working my ass off. And it was when I did some month-long retreat and was really working with the teacher to tap into the conditions that create the first jhana. And it was seeing that it was literally putting down those 5 conditions and just bringing them together in an completely effortless way. And then jhana arises. And that was just such an eye-opener for me to see cause and effect. See, it's this non-striving. And it's funny because the first time I kind of slipped into these, it was probably this energetic quality, that probably the PT quality. I was doing it during sitting meditation. I went to lay down to take a rest. I laid down and it just popped in like 10 times stronger. And I realized, oh, I needed that relaxed quality, the effortlessness, and the laying down actually helped that quite a bit. And even so, I spent the rest of the month doing laying down meditation. Like I was in my room just 24/7, which was the opposite of how I'd ever done retreat before. It was always in the Dharma hall, always with others. And I spent an entire month on my back. And that was those pieces, just seeing how it's just literally bringing pieces together and then it goes off. It's kind of like that. The image arises. Have you heard of this term, tickling the dragon's tail, that they used to do? This is back in when they were trying to figure out how to bring uranium bricks together and how close they needed to get a nuclear explosion. And these guys would take uranium bricks in a neutron counter and they would just push them a little closer to each other, measure the distance, look at the neutron counter, and push. And it was called tickling the dragon's tail because you push them to a point where it's just about to create this huge chain reaction. And it's not that anything else is happening. It's just that there's this, you're bringing the conditions together. And here's the conditions for a nuclear explosion. And it's literally like that. Here are the conditions for this absorptive concentration to arise. And it's really on its own. Just bringing condition together. And that was mind-blowing for me. And that's when I realized it's not about striving at all. It's about perseverance. It's about clear seeing, but it's not about striving. Striving is you, or striving is me pushing, trying to get something. And that's the opposite of what the practice is. And so that blew my head open.
Yeah, that is one of the most difficult concepts for folks who are very much achievers. There is something to grasp, to reach for and grasp, and that's going to be problematic from the very outset.
Yes. As I'm a testimonial, give me a call anytime you want a testimonial for striving. I'm there.
Well, you are the director of research of the Center for Mindfulness. So for the listeners who may not be familiar with the center, would you just take a moment to describe what that is?
Sure. And I will try to, because I have just come to the center a couple of months ago, literally. So I am new to it as well. But the center, I like to joke with John, this is the house that John built. So John Kabat-Zinn started this stress reduction clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in 1979, I think. And they were if I get the facts right, which I'm sure I won't, but it's something like they had an office in a closet and their classroom was in a cafeteria. So not the most favorable conditions, but they persevered. And 35 years later, we now have, mindfulness on the cover of Time magazine, and is directly related to that vision that John had in terms of creating an accessible Dharma for anyone. And so he started with medical schools because it made a lot of sense. That's where there's a lot of dukkha. Go to the hospital and you will find a lot of suffering. So the Center for Mindfulness started this stress reduction clinic. They started this program that could be studied called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, which many people probably know of, this 8-week program. And they've now, just through their center alone, have run over 20,000 people through the program, 20,000 people. And have trained MBSR instructors. There are like 750 sites or something like that across the world now that teach this, and many, many more mindfulness teachers that are out teaching, in their communities or at their local hospitals or at their clinics. So the Center for Mindfulness has a real rich history in the U.S. I mean, again, orders of magnitude shorter than monasteries and all of the other traditions that come out of Asia, but it's really one of the foundational pieces in the United States. So the Center for Mindfulness had a couple of core missions. One was the mindfulness-based stress reduction, so the clinic itself. The other is the OASIS Institute, which is the teaching institute for training MBSR instructors. And I have to say, this was one thing that drew me to work at the Center for Mindfulness, was that they actually were so careful about rigorous training for teachers, because this is when any fad explodes, then people are going to want to jump on board. And it's, maintaining the integrity is really, really important. Otherwise, it's much harder to figure out what's real. So they've done research throughout the time that the clinic has been around, but they really wanted to ramp that up. And the medical school just gave them last year their own building that's 25,000 square feet, that's dedicated space for the Center for Mindfulness. And the conditions were coming together for them. They wanted a director of research. My work at Yale was going pretty well. And they said, we started getting in conversation. I think I'd given a talk at a neuroimaging seminar or something up at UMass. And they got very interested and said, this might be a very good match here. We wanted somebody that can head the research. And, you do mindfulness research.
And you do this stuff.
You do this stuff. And I think there was also a real match in terms of integrity, because we all really want to maintain not only integrity of the practice and the teaching, but also the integrity of the research. And it's been very helpful. Probably the most helpful thing for me was that I didn't start doing mindfulness research until I'd practiced for over 10 years. And hadn't even thought of doing mindfulness research. I really had a foundation in practice before doing any research, which really informs everything that I do. It's just been such a gift to never have thought about doing research in this space before starting to do it. So the conditions came together for me to join as the director of research, and this formed the third pillar of the Center for Mindfulness, where now we have a core mission that involves research. And they even renovated the building at the same time that they were recruiting my lab, so we could actually develop space that was very conducive to all of this. And there's a beautiful aspect to the center. There are classrooms that are contiguous with the instructors' offices, which are also contiguous with my lab. And so the lab, everybody rubs elbows all the time. And I think that's really critical for the mission, reminding the researchers why they're there. And my lab, they all practice, so they get it. But also for the teachers to be able to see what's going on in the research, for the research to be able to interact with the teachers, to ask them, what about this? What about this? What about this? And then to have that research be built right in to the core mission when the students are coming through the clinic. And we see over 1,000 patients come through the stress reduction clinic every year. So it's also a great place to be able to recruit folks to do the work that we're doing.
Yeah, that co-location of the three pillars of what the Center for Mindfulness is doing is so critical. And that's one of the things I admire most about their work is the dedication to not just the helping of people who are suffering, and certainly that's a huge part of this. It's foundational to what we do, but also the integrity to ensuring that we're doing it right, and that the teachers of mindfulness practices have their own vibrant and long-standing practice. That this isn't something you can just say, here's your book, follow the manual, and you'll be fine. That's enough. No, you really do need to practice this yourself.
Yes. I'm laughing because it seems like a no-brainer, but it's sometimes we have to state that.
So tell us a little bit more about this particular pillar. This is a new part of the center. And what are you hoping that some of the things will come out of this opportunity, or what are some of the objectives of this research branch?
We have several. There were several projects that my lab had started that we brought from Yale. And so we'll be able to continue those and hopefully even do them more efficiently and more carefully with the resources that we have at the center. We did some clinical work where we did some randomized trials with mindfulness training for smoking cessation and found, that it was actually twice as good as gold standard treatment, the American Lung Association's freedom from smoking, and had started building a way to deliver this in a way that maintains the fidelity, but also is disseminatable. So we built an iPhone app that we could pair with an online community so people could get the didactic components in a way that was accessible. So we had a practitioner who was an actress, and she recorded our scripts. We have animations that were developed by two people who quit smoking using mindfulness training. And we can package all of this into an app. And then we can pair this with an online community so that people can go to the community, get support, ask, I can support the community anywhere in the world. So we have people, in Italy, we have, people in the Netherlands. People can sign up anywhere and they can access the community and ask questions, which, if you bring those two components together to, I guess the analogy would be the Dharma, the teachings, and the Sangha. And, of course, however you define Buddha, I like to think of it as Buddha nature. We all have the capacity to awaken. And so you can bring those together in a format that is accessible through web, through iPhones, and through Android devices. So that's one study that we're going to launch in a couple of months, and we'll be able to do it through the Center for Mindfulness. We've gotten funding from the National Cancer Institute to do that. They're very supportive and excited about this project. So that's one, that's a clinical aspect to this that we can move forward. We're also very interested in the neural correlates of mindfulness, and not just from there's a neat blob in the brain that lights up, when you meditate. And I have to say that because the cognitive neuroscience community has come under a lot of flack lately because there have been a lot of papers published showing a lot of blobs in the brain, but there hasn't been a lot of movement in terms of practical applicability of that. And, as an addiction psychiatrist, my patients are suffering. Again, I've logged many, many hours suffering. And so to really see how we can turn those blobs into, how can we learn from this? How can we have this be practical and useful? My teacher, Joseph Goldstein, says it's pragmatic. This stuff is pragmatic, and it's got to stay pragmatic. And yes, it absolutely. It's not helpful if it's not pragmatic. And the Buddha, he didn't teach, well, here's the theory behind the end of suffering.
Yeah, this is materially actionable and impactful in people's lives. Otherwise, really, what is the point then?
Right. And I think everything that, all the core teachings are very, very pragmatic. Here's how you do it. In the Satipatthana Sutta, it's the direct path. It's not and here's my thesis that's 4,000 pages long. So we had found some brain regions that were very interesting that seemed to be kind of a doorway into the networks that are probably involved in, I'm just going to say, effortless awareness. And also these same brain regions are involved in, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, getting caught up in experience. And so there's a particular brain region called the posterior cingulate that gets activated when we're craving, when we're thinking about ourselves, when we're thinking about the past and future, when we're ruminating, when we're depressed, when we're anxious, when we're feeling guilty, when we're justifying a choice that we've made. All of these things that seem to line up with this, mental or even physical sense of clenching. And that clenching is pretty close to clinging, which is pretty close to, well, it's directly related to dependent origination. So that's really interesting. It's even more interesting that brain region, when we looked across the entire brain in a completely agnostic way and said, what's going on? First, we found not a single brain region getting increased in activity when experienced meditators are meditating, not a single one. And we looked hard because that's what we expect to find something doing something. And in fact, the brain was pretty quiet. And there were brain regions, again, this posterior cingulate in particular, that were even more quiet than other brain regions. And we did several studies. We even did a replication study. We wanted to make sure that this was actually true. And when we included some neurofeedback studies where we could bring the subjective experience together with the brain activity so that people could really line up their subjective experience with their brain activity. So blobs having meaning, saying, okay, that blob gets lit up when this happens. And we did some neurophenomenological experiments where we could really just have, in a data-driven manner, have the subjective experience tell us what was going on in this brain region. And it confirmed what a lot of these other studies showed, which was, yes, when we're trying to do things, when we're getting caught up in experience, the PCC gets activated. And when we're concentrated, it gets deactivated. Great. but also when people were effortlessly aware, when they were just resting in awareness, it also got really, really quiet. And it got really quiet when people were being curious. And so depending on how you translate the second factor of awakening, that interest, that curiosity, that totally bottomed out the posterior cingulate. And we even found this with Christian contemplatives. We found it with different, with Zen practitioners, with Tibetan practitioners. And so there seems to be this brain region that is a common toggle switch, regardless of tradition and even beyond tradition. So when people are getting caught up in experience, this gets activated. And we found that novices were even learning to deactivate this brain region really, really quickly. This is where the striving piece comes back in. We had one novice, 9 minutes into the experiment. It wasn't even a try to change your brain experiment. It was just a, hey, let's see if this lines up with your experience experiment. And he said, I don't think this thing is working because I was thinking about my breath and the brain region got activated. And in the very next run, his brain looked completely different. And he said, oh, I get it. Feeling the physical sensation of the breath rather than thinking in and out. And so this guy, talk about learning non-striving in 9 minutes. Man, I wish I had that 15 years ago. And these guys were coming out of the scanner going, wow, that was amazing. When can I come back and do that again?
When you bring $10,000 with you to pay for the scans. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, that might be a good segue for us to talk a little bit about what you see as some of the challenges faced today with mindfulness research.
Boy, how long do we have?
Much time as you need.
Well, I don't want to bore folks. There are many, many challenges. This is a very, very young field. So just some of the challenges. Let's start with, how do you measure mindfulness? There are self-report measures of mindfulness out there that have come under heavy fire because they basically measure the absence of mind wandering, and the absence of mind wandering doesn't equal the presence of mindfulness. And to their credit, nobody's come up with anything better. It's just, this is version 1.0 of our self-reported measures of mindfulness. And I think, so if you have a self-reported measure of mindfulness, then anybody that has a Psychology 101 class can just give it to their students as a requirement and then measure something and then report on it. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit right now in terms of mindfulness does this, mindfulness doesn't do this, mindfulness, and all based on these, they're calling it trait measures of mindfulness. And again, it's the best that's out there right now. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge to, one, have all this blitz of research come out and try to make sense of it. There are these reports that mindfulness is detrimental for implicit learning, that mindfulness is bad for creativity and all these things. And it just really muddles up the literature. So that's a challenge. How do we measure mindfulness? We'd love to have objective measures. And, that's where some of these biological markers may be helpful, but we have a long way to go before we can really figure out if these are legitimate or not. That's one challenge. Another challenge is fidelity. There are a lot of papers coming out with mindfulness-based interventions, and we don't know how qualified the people are that are teaching it. And if they're even very, very qualified people, are they actually following the manualized treatment? You need a protocol. And so folks like Becca Crane and Willem Kuyken, they've developed a wonderful competency framework to start measuring competency. So I think that's going to help a lot. It's going to need to be disseminated, and we're going to try to help with that. That's one thing that the center is really interested in doing. And so, measuring competencies, making sure that there's a standard of quality that's maintained, which is very important because as a medical doctor, I can't walk down the street prescribing medications unless I have a license. And sure, it's not that one should have a licensing body, but it'd be helpful to have some criteria for determining the level of competency. If I went to a dentist, I'd love to know that they've actually gone to dental school.
Completed it, maybe done a few tooth extractions.
Right, and passed their exams. Like they didn't muck up somebody's mouth. This Hippocratic Oath, I think, applies here. First, do no harm. First, do no harm. That's really important. So competencies is an important piece. Another challenge here is that tons of people are coming up with, my version of mindfulness. And it's wonderful that people are inspired to come up with their version of mindfulness, but it makes it much harder to do cross comparisons between studies because you don't know if, Joe's mindfulness is similar to Susie's mindfulness. So it'd be nice to have some standardization where people, everybody uses, some standard training. And I think, MBSR is a good example of that. MBCT is as well, where those are widely disseminated, but there's still lots of people coming up with lots of different things. It'd be great to see that kind of settle down a little bit. And I understand that it's important to develop these types of things for specific disorders. And so there's a trade-off with all of this. So those are some of the challenges. I think funding is always a challenge. In science right now, funding's at one of its lowest levels ever. It's been consistently cut by the NIH for over 10 years, since 2004. So funding is really difficult across the board. And then funding in mindfulness training is also difficult to get because a lot of people still see it as woo-woo. So can't do any research if you don't have funding.
Judd, I wonder if in your own research on addiction issues, if there has been any work around a comparison on exactly that. Here's the long-term costs of someone with an addiction, ongoing treatments, hospitalization, medical, all the rest of that stuff when compared with preventative measures and those potentially much lower costs. Has anyone done that kind of study yet?
My short answer is they probably have, and I just don't know. I mean, the preventative medicine in general, so forget mindfulness, but just across the board, as this country grapples with its escalating healthcare costs, it's realizing that, preventative medicine is actually a good idea. And a lot of that goes all the way back to, the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry. So there are these large behemoths in place that have this huge amount of momentum. And the momentum a lot of times comes from profits and money. So it's really hard to change a lot of this momentum from, let's fix something that's broken to, hey, let's prevent it breaking in the first place. And it goes without saying, like, the preventive medicine is just so much more cost effective. I can't say, specifically. I don't even have to remember the numbers because it's not equivocal. And the same is true even for smoking. So, for example, smokers cost employers $3,000 to $4,000 per year just because they smoke extra compared to other employees because of the smoke breaks they take, because they're sicker, because of all these things. $3,000 to $4,000 per year. So if you spend a couple $100s to help somebody quit smoking, that's a no-brainer. That's orders of magnitude cheaper in terms of preventing not only the immediate cost, but long-term as well, because of smoking is the leading cause of preventable morbidity and mortality in the U.S. It's just huge. And I'm sure that applies to all these other conditions as well.
I think that's where there's so much need for validation of the efficacy of various kinds of treatments, not just mindfulness, but any kind of treatment around things like depression, anxiety, all the rest of the plethora of kinds of human suffering, that maybe we can avoid that if we're, for example, having programs and teaching in particular practices people can do for free that they learn early on to prevent these kinds of conditions from arising in the first place.
Right. And that's where things like the mindful schools movement and all this stuff, early intervention, is going to be really interesting to see how this plays out down the road.
Well, our guest today has been Dr. Judson Brewer, the Director of Research at the Center for Mindfulness. We'll be linking to Judd's Huffington Post blog. Judd, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.